It was January 24th, 1989. Outside Florida State Prison, a crowd was already gathering. Hundreds of people holding signs, chanting, some celebrating, some weeping, all waiting for the clock to strike 7 a.m. when the most infamous serial killer in American history, Theodore Robert Bundy, would be strapped to the electric chair. But what most people don't know, what happened inside those final hours, was darker, more unsettling, and more revealing than anyone watching from outside could have imagined. This is not just the story of Bundy's death. It is the story of fear and fury colliding with justice, of confessions whispered too late, and of the chilling truth that even in his last breaths, Ted Bundy kept secrets that may never fully be uncovered. Stay with me until the end, because the most shocking part isn't his execution. It's what Bundy said and didn't say before he died. The prison woke early that day. Long before the sun rose, the gray walls of Florida State Prison echoed with the metallic clatter of guards preparing the chamber. In a small cell known as Death Watch, Bundy sat awake, pale and restless. He had spent 9 years on death row, fighting, delaying, manipulating the legal system with every appeal he could conjure. But this time there were no more stays, no more lawyers to twist the law in his favor. He knew it, and so did everyone else. Hours before dawn, he sat on his narrow cot, staring at the ceiling. Reporters who had spoken to him days before described a man alternating between arrogance and desperation, sometimes smiling with his trademark charm, other times trembling like a cornered animal. His last meal sat untouched. Steak, eggs, hash browns, toast with butter and jelly, milk and juice. The food was still warm when guards noticed he hadn't touched it. Bundy wasn't hungry. He was haunted. But haunted by what? By the dozens of women he murdered and mutilated across 7 states? By the ones he never admitted to killing? Or was he haunted by the realization that for the first time in his life, he was utterly powerless? Bundy had always controlled the narrative. He had lured women with fake casts, charming smiles, and a voice dripping with false kindness. He had convinced courts, girlfriends, even reporters that he was misunderstood. But this time, there were no games left, only the chair. And outside the prison walls, the crowd swelled. Some held signs that read, "Burn, Bundy, burn." Others shouted prayers for his soul. Families of his victims stood shoulder to shoulder with strangers who simply wanted to see evil destroyed. Inside, the man at the center of it all sat in silence. But silence, in Bundy's case, was never just silence. It was calculation. And in those last hours, he had one final calculation to make. What secret should he take with him? And what could he reveal to buy himself just a little more time? The day before his execution, Bundy had met with investigators one last time. And suddenly, the man who had spent years denying, minimizing, and dodging started to talk. He began naming victims. Young women whose families had waited more than a decade for answers. Women who had simply disappeared into the night. Some names the police already suspected. Others were new. It was as if Bundy, for the first time, wanted to be seen for what he truly was. Not just a killer, but a master of secrets. But his motives weren't confession, they were bargaining. Bundy dangled information like a man holding out gold. He whispered hints of murders in Oregon, Utah, Washington. He even admitted to necrophilia, to revisiting his victims' bodies long after the murders. Investigators leaned in, desperate for closure. Families prayed outside the room, hoping this monster would finally name their daughter. But Bundy was playing the same game he had always played, giving just enough to keep people listening, withholding enough to maintain power. And as dawn crept closer, it became clear. Bundy had no intention of revealing everything. He would go to the grave with secrets because that, too, was part of his control. And for the families who never got answers, it was one last, devastating act of cruelty. At 3 a.m., Bundy met with a Methodist minister, Reverend Fred Lawrence. Witnesses said the killer seemed nervous, shifting in his chair, his hands trembling. The Reverend asked if Bundy had anything to confess, anything to repent. Bundy didn't talk about the women. He didn't beg for forgiveness. Instead, he blamed pornography. In his final television interview just hours before his death, Bundy told Christian broadcaster James Dobson that violent pornography had fueled his desires, that it had twisted him into a killer. It was Bundy's last manipulation, a desperate attempt to shift blame, to paint himself as both monster and victim. But survivors, victims' families, and even law enforcement were furious. They knew the truth. Bundy had been hunting long before pornography became his excuse. He didn't kill because of magazines. He killed because of power, because of lust, because of the thrill of domination. And yet, as the Reverend prayed for his soul, Bundy nodded along, as if he believed salvation was still possible. Was it fear of hell that haunted him that night? Or was it fear of finally becoming what he had always been to his victims? Nothing more than a body? By 5 a.m., the crowd outside had doubled. Reporters compared the atmosphere to a sporting event. Vendors sold t-shirts that read, "Fry Bundy, fry." People brought coolers, radios, even fireworks. It was a carnival of justice, fueled by rage and grief. But not everyone was celebrating. Among the crowd were parents clutching faded photographs of daughters who never came home. They weren't there for spectacle. They were there for closure. Inside the prison, Bundy could hear the faint chants through the concrete walls. Every cheer, every shout, every drumbeat of "Burn, Bundy, burn" was a reminder. The world would not mourn him. At 6 a.m., guards came to collect him. Bundy's face, once so smug in courtrooms, had drained of color. He shuffled down the corridor known as the last mile. Witnesses noted his lips were trembling, his eyes darting. The killer who had once strutted into courtrooms, representing himself with arrogant confidence, was now a broken man. But then something strange happened. As he entered the execution chamber, Bundy suddenly lifted his chin. He looked at the reporters, the witnesses, the guards, and for just a moment, that old Bundy charm flickered back. As if to say, "You will never forget me." The chair was called Old Sparky, wooden, worn, built for one purpose. Bundy was strapped in arms, legs, chest bound with thick leather. A metal skullcap was placed on his head. A sponge soaked in saline pressed against his shaved scalp. The room went silent. Reporters clutched their pens. Victims' families held their breath. A guard asked Bundy if he had any last words. His voice was soft, almost inaudible. "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." That was it. No apology, no admission, just a final act of selfishness, leaving the families with nothing. At 7:06 a.m., the switch was thrown. Witnesses said Bundy's body jolted violently, smoke rising from his leg as the current surged. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. 1 minute later, he was dead. The crowd outside erupted into cheers. Fireworks exploded. People danced in the streets. Justice had been served, or had it, because even in death, Bundy's legacy wasn't finished. For years after his execution, investigators continued to uncover Bundy's trail. New evidence suggested he had killed far more women than he ever admitted, possibly dozens more. Some experts believe the true number may be close to 100. And here's the haunting truth. Bundy died with secrets. He died with names unspoken, graves unmarked, families left forever in limbo. He had confessed, but only on his terms. He had revealed, but only enough to maintain control. Even in death, Bundy won, because he left the world still wondering, how many more victims were there? What else was he hiding? And most disturbing of all, were there others like him, walking free, hiding behind smiles and charm? Ted Bundy's execution was supposed to end his story, but instead it opened another, because in the months after his death, strange letters began arriving. Letters claiming Bundy hadn't acted alone. Letters suggesting that his killings were part of something bigger, darker, and far more organized than anyone dared believe. Were they hoaxes? Or had Bundy carried one final, terrifying secret to his grave? The answer might change everything we thought we knew about America's most infamous killer. The execution was supposed to be the end. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was declared dead. His ashes were scattered in Washington, near the Cascade Mountains where he once buried victims. The nation sighed in relief. The nightmare was over, or so they thought. Weeks later, an envelope arrived at the office of a Florida newspaper. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper, typed. It read, "Bundy did not act alone. Look deeper. Some of the girls were not his." The truth was never told. Investigators dismissed it as a hoax. But then more letters came, to police stations in Washington, to the parents of missing girls, to a reporter who had covered Bundy's trial. Each one carried the same message. Bundy's story was not complete. And suddenly, a terrifying possibility emerged. Had Ted Bundy taken his darkest secret to the grave? Bundy was a lone wolf, at least that's how history painted him. He lured women, killed alone, and buried his crimes under charm and deception. But as investigators revisited his past, questions arose. In Utah, a victim's friend swore she saw Bundy with another man the night of her disappearance. In Colorado, a witness reported two men dragging a young woman into a car. And in Florida, police quietly speculated that some of the killings Bundy confessed to didn't fit his established pattern at all. Could Bundy have been part of a network? In the 1970s, several serial killers stalked America at the same time: John Wayne Gacy in Illinois, the Hillside Stranglers in California, David Berkowitz in New York. They operated miles apart, yet shared disturbingly similar methods of control. FBI profiler John Douglas once wondered aloud, what if Bundy wasn't unique? What if he was part of something we never uncovered? Bundy himself hinted at it. In his final confessions, he told detectives, "There are things you'll never know, things you'll never find." Were those words arrogance or warning? Bundy admitted to killing more than 30 women, but investigators believe the real number was far higher. Some estimates climb toward 100. Yet even that number may not tell the whole story. Forensic files reveal at least a dozen missing women whose disappearances Bundy hinted at, but never confirmed. Some vanished hundreds of miles away from Bundy's known locations. Others disappeared on dates when Bundy was already in custody. Take the case of Nancy Baird, a 23-year-old Utah woman who vanished in 1975. Bundy was linked, but the timeline never quite fit. Then there was Marie Burr, an 8-year-old in Tacoma who disappeared in 1961, when Bundy was only 14. He denied involvement, but kept a chilling silence whenever her name came up. And then there were victims whose bodies were never found at all. To this day, families wait. Mothers grow old with questions unanswered. Siblings whisper about what really happened. And the shadow of Bundy stretches long beyond the grave. Here's where the story darkens further. After Bundy's arrest in 1975, women continued to vanish across the Pacific Northwest. Some killings mirrored Bundy's method. Strangulation, secluded sites, bodies left in wooded areas. But Bundy was already behind bars. Copycats? Or collaborators? Former detectives whispered theories of Bundy apprentices. Young men who followed him, learned from him, maybe even assisted him. After all, Bundy thrived on power. What greater power than passing on his methods to someone else? One former prison guard claimed Bundy once boasted, "There are men out there who know what I know. They'll keep working, long after I'm gone. No names, no proof, just words." But the disappearances were real, and the letters arriving after his execution only deepened the mystery. Among the letters that surfaced, one stood out. It described Bundy not as a lone killer, but as part of a shadowy underground. A cult, the letter claimed, that fed on violence, power, and secrecy. It sounded like conspiracy madness. But then, certain details matched facts not released to the public. The writer described a burial site in the Cascades. Investigators checked, and though they found no bodies, they did find disturbed earth, freshly turned, weeks after Bundy's ashes had been scattered there. Coincidence? Hoax? Or something darker? Bundy's fascination with control, his obsession with secrecy, and his cryptic final interviews. Suddenly, they looked less like arrogance and more like a man hinting at truths too dangerous to say aloud. Ted Bundy's family rarely spoke after his death. His mother, Louise, wept as she defended her son to the very end. She believed he was innocent. His wife, Carol and Boone, divorced him before his execution and vanished into obscurity. Their daughter, Rose, grew up in hiding. But years later, distant relatives admitted something unsettling. Bundy had hinted to family members that he wasn't the only one. What did he mean? Another killer? Another hand guiding him? Or was it just another manipulation, designed to torment even those closest to him? Psychologists studying Bundy after death came to a chilling conclusion. Bundy's greatest addiction wasn't sex, violence, or even murder. It was secrecy. Bundy thrived on withholding information, on leaving others powerless. His killings weren't just about bodies, they were about knowledge. He controlled what was known, what was suspected, and what would never be discovered. So perhaps the greatest cruelty of all was that Bundy may have orchestrated this very outcome. To die with secrets so large, so tantalizing, that the world would never stop speaking his name. And in that way, he won. But while Bundy's myths grew, the survivors told a different story. Women who escaped him, like Carol Duranch, who narrowly fled when Bundy tried to handcuff her in his car, testified that he wasn't a superhuman predator. He was clumsy. He made mistakes. He was human. And that truth matters. Because while Bundy's legend paints him as larger than life, the reality is that he was a coward, a manipulator, a man who preyed on the vulnerable and then hid behind charm. The survivors remind us, Bundy should not be mythologized. He should be remembered for what he really was. More than 3 decades later, Bundy's name still echoes. Films, books, documentaries, his face, his smile, his crimes, endlessly dissected. But beneath the headlines and the Hollywood retellings, real questions remain unanswered. How many did he truly kill? Did he act alone? And what truths lie buried, forever silenced by the flick of a switch in Florida's electric chair? The haunting part isn't just what Bundy did. It's what we may never know. Ted Bundy was executed in 1989. His ashes scattered, his body gone, but his shadow lives on, in case files unsolved, in families still searching for daughters, in letters that hint at networks of darkness we've barely glimpsed. And then, there's the final mystery. In 1992, 3 years after his death, a hunter in Oregon stumbled upon a shallow grave. Inside were the remains of a young woman, bound in a way eerily similar to Bundy's known victims. Next to the body lay a note. 5 words, scrawled in ink. He was not alone. Was it a cruel joke? A coincidence? Or the last echo of Bundy's unfinished story? Ted Bundy was executed in 1989. His body reduced to ash, his story supposed to end. But it didn't. Decades later, his name still lingers. Books, films, documentaries, endless debates. His face, his smile, his crimes, still dissected, still consumed. But here's the haunting question. Who is remembered more, the killer or the killed? Because while Bundy's myth grew, his victims, real women with real dreams, remained shadows. And their families, their pain, their unfinished stories were pushed aside by the legend of the monster. This is not Bundy's story anymore. This is theirs. Carol Duranch was just 18 when Bundy tricked her outside a Utah mall in 1974. He flashed a fake badge, claimed her car was broken into, and asked her to come with him. She obeyed. He was handsome, confident, official. But when she got into his car, she noticed something wrong. The passenger door had no handle. Bundy snapped a cuff around her wrist. Carol fought. She kicked, scratched, screamed until she wriggled free and bolted into the street. She survived. But her life was never the same. She carried the weight of being the one who got away. She testified in court, her voice shaking as she faced the man who had nearly killed her. And even decades later, she confessed, "You don't escape someone like that. Not really. You just live with it." Other women weren't so lucky, but Carol's survival shattered Bundy's myth of invincibility. He was not a genius predator. He was clumsy, careless, beatable. The survivors remind us, Bundy was not a legend. He was a coward, and cowardice bleeds through even the darkest monsters. For every survivor, there were dozens of families who never saw their daughters again. Denise Naslund, 19. Janice Ott, 23. Kimberly Leach, 12. Names that appeared in headlines for a time, then faded. But for their families, the pain never faded. Denise's mother once said she kept her daughter's bedroom exactly as it was, unable to pack away the clothes, the books, the photographs. Kimberly's father described the silence in his house as unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards reminded him of the child who should have been running down the hallway. Some families never even had remains to bury. Bundy left them in forests, mountains, rivers. Some were never found. That uncertainty, the not knowing, was its own torture. One mother called it the second death, the death of hope, and that's Bundy's true legacy. Not just the women he killed, but the families he condemned to lifetimes of waiting. Bundy fooled nearly everyone, but the hardest truth came for the investigators who chased him. Detectives in Utah admitted they ignored early warnings because Bundy seemed too clean-cut. Colorado police let him slip through their fingers. Twice. In Florida, he was pulled over driving a stolen car, but the officer never suspected he had just left a sorority house where he'd murdered 2 women and brutalized 3 more. Why did he escape justice for so long? The answer was privilege. Bundy was white, educated, articulate. He looked like the boy next door, and so, for years, he hid behind society's blind spots. One FBI profiler later said, if Bundy had been poor, uneducated, or a minority, he would have been caught after the first murder. It was a lesson learned too late. Even in death, Bundy became something grotesque, a cultural icon. Women wrote him love letters in prison. Fans debated his good looks and intelligence. Hollywood cast heartthrobs to play him. But every time Bundy's smile was splashed across a movie poster, his victims were pushed further into the background. Their names forgotten, their faces erased. That fascination with killers is a societal sickness. We turn monsters into celebrities while the women they destroyed remain nameless. And Bundy, manipulator to the end, would have loved it. But there are lessons. Hard, costly, painful lessons. Because of Bundy, law enforcement changed how they profile predators. They began looking past charm and privilege, past race and class, and into patterns of behavior. Because of Bundy, missing persons networks grew stronger. Databases were connected. Families of the missing found more tools to search for answers. And because of Bundy, society was forced to face a truth it had long ignored. Evil does not always look like evil. Sometimes it looks like the man you'd never suspect. Too often, Bundy's story centers on Bundy. But here, let's name the women. Linda and Healy, Donna Gail Manson, Susan Rancourt, Roberta Parks, Brenda Ball, Nancy Wilcox, Melissa Smith, Laura M., Debbie Kent. These were not Bundy's victims. They were women, students, daughters, sisters, dreamers, each with lives cut brutally short. Bundy does not deserve to overshadow them. Their names must outlive his. Ted Bundy is gone, his ashes scattered, his smile faded into history, but his ghost remains, in the survivors who live with scars, in the families who never got answers, in the investigators who regret the time they lost. The question is no longer who was Ted Bundy. The question is, why do we still let killers define the story, while the victims fade into shadows? And yet, one final mystery lingers. In 2011, forensic investigators in Washington tested DNA from an unsolved case. The evidence came back partial, uncertain, but it bore eerie similarities to Bundy's profile. The problem? The murder happened in 1989, months after Bundy was executed. So was it a copycat? A mistake? Or had Bundy's darkness infected others, leaving behind disciples still hidden in plain sight? The truth remains uncertain, and that is where the story of Bundy's ghost continues.